Okay, good morning everybody. Before I get into the presentation, I'd also just like to take a minute to talk about the incredible journey it was to finally make it here. It was nearly 2 years to make it to this conference. And I'd really like to thank Elena Arseneva for her persistence and patience as well for putting up with all the different things that seemed to go wrong. I don't believe in bad luck. I think you make your own luck. But it did feel like we were going to be unlucky for a while. But we'd finally made it, so I'm very glad to be here. So let's see. I want to talk to you about, I guess I really want to just discuss software development with you today. I mean, why we fail, I want to talk about that a little bit. But I guess it'd be more important to maybe give you some tips and techniques on how to avoid failure than spend too much time on the why. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we fail and then really just talk to you about my perspectives on software development. As a project manager, someone that's been doing this for a very long time, I'm very successful at it, and I really want to share with you what I believe are the keys to this, and it's not going to be what you expect. So I guess just to start, the first thing I want to say is, you know, this stuff I'm going to talk about is actually really simple. In terms of reasons, you know, they're not complicated, they're not rocket science, there's not some sort of complicated formula as to why software goes the way it does. So it's not really about the content per se, it's really about execution. So while this stuff is simple and it's going to sound basic, the simplicity is actually though hard. And why is that? I think that's a really interesting question. The solutions to most of our problems in IT were identified long ago. So the really interesting question then is, so why don't we do them? But if we talk about these things, everyone sort of nods and says, yeah, well, that's okay. I'd rather hear whatever your silver bullet you're going to try and give me today. In my experience, it's really focusing on those things we already know and actually doing them well that'll make the difference. So, a few examples. There were 2 projects. This was actually a controlled study run by Jerry Weinberg. 2 projects were set up for comparison. One went well, one didn't go so well. What happened? Well, the second team complained that the first project cheated. They did what we can't. They insisted on user participation. They wouldn't start without it. We didn't get access to our users, so they cheated. Why is my screen gone blank? All right. So they cheated. The first project insisted on having all the hardware they needed in place. Oh, there we go, we're back. Before they started, we didn't have all the PCs we needed, we didn't even have the server set up until some time later. So they cheated. Now, these things sound silly, you know, and sort of sound obvious. We say, well, we would never do that, right, when you hear these things. But we do these sorts of things all the time. And each of these little things has an implication, and they add up, often in ways that are hard for us to see. Right? And as humans, we're not very good at seeing the cumulative effect of a lot of little things that add up over time. Right? This is something we're particularly bad at, and it's not just an IT thing, this is a phenomenon in a lot of cases. That's why there's a whole industry around helping people make budgets for their homes, or around dieting. Because, you know, we forget we ate that little bit extra yesterday, or we ate a little bit extra this morning, or I spent a little bit extra yesterday, I spent a little bit extra last week, and then at the end of the month we get a surprise, either on the scales or on our bank balance. But we're not good at seeing the cumulative effects of a lot of little things over time. And so when I look at project failure, and that's the #1 probably engagement, consulting engagement I do, I'm usually called in to large projects in very big companies that have failed. Right? Or that sense failure. And I can tell you in my experience, it's almost never this one thing is the reason why you failed. If only back on day, 73, when we had a decision, and we decided to turn right, if only we had decided to turn left, then everything would have been okay. In my experience, that's never the case. Right? It's death by 1,000 cuts. So all these little things matter. And then you've got, conferences like this and a whole lot of people that will stand up, and particularly with the internet these days where it's very easy to publish yourself without any real credibility, who do you believe? At a conference I was at a few years ago, there are two well-known people, I'm not going to name them, that's not the point, but the first keynote says, no more methods, we don't need any more, right? All the solutions have already been identified. The second keynote speaker says, but we're not doing them, right? These already identified solutions aren't being implemented. Right? And so therefore they don't work, and therefore we do need new methods. So, who do you believe? I can tell you what we as an industry keep looking for is that silver bullet, where that silver bullet is some sort of technique or a tool or a process. Right? And that doesn't work, and you would think in the 30 years or more we've been doing this, we would have figured that out by now. But I don't think we have, and so doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, yeah, is not that smart. So, what I want to contrast and talk about today a little bit is what I consider project administration versus project management. So if anyone here is into PMI or Prince2 or all of these sorts of things, I think that stuff's rather worthless. And I consider that project administration, right? So learning how to do a Gantt chart or fill in a spreadsheet and track a budget doesn't really help you manage a software team, right? Software construction is a human activity. And unless we can learn, think, deal with people systems, we've really got no hope with the software systems we're trying to get those people to build for us. And I think now more than ever, that's true. And then I want to talk about process itself versus people. I'm going to spend the whole day on Thursday talking about a process I created, and obviously I like it, but people is really what matters. Process is really secondary. The process can be a good enabler. And I think to be agile, what you really need is agile people. And some processes are going to enable this better than others, and maybe after the workshop on Thursday you'll get some insights into, okay, which one of these things should I choose? Right? Which one of these things, these processes is going to actually better fit my needs and will enable the kinds of things I think are important. So what I want to do today is share with you a few administrative tools and a few people tools that might help you be more successful. So the first one I want to talk about a fair bit is discipline. Now we know that simplicity is better, and yet we make more complexity. Yeah? Why? Abominations like J2EE and, well, there's a long list of things like that. Yeah? XML-based rules engines in between a client and a server. We know meaningful function names are better, for example. There's two good examples of a pretty poor function name and a much more explicit meaningful function name. I mean, we know all these things. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but why do we rarely see code that looks like this? We know we need access to users, right? But we rarely get it. And what do we do about that? Well, usually nothing. We default. And I think IT organisations default far too often, particularly with the business. How can you delight the users if you don't have access to them? How is that possible? Well, how can you hit a target if you don't know what the target is? Although I would also say on the flip side of that, as IT people, we are terrifically good at assuming on other people's behalf, though. We're pretty excellent at that, and it's a bad behaviour. So we can't default on these things, and one of our roles is to actually educate those around us, especially those above us and those below us, the different kinds of education profiles. I'm going to talk a lot about that on Thursday, but I'll give you some strategies for how to do that as well, particularly how do you educate upper management about what we should be doing. But it needs the discipline, right, to be persistent about these things that we know matter. So all these little things that you do, or that we don't do, or cut corners on or whatever, add up, and they add up in really big ways, and they add up in ways that actually lead to project failure. Right? And yet we're surprised. You come in and look at a place and it's, okay, yeah, we have coding standards, but we're not really following them. We have version control, but we're not actually doing tagging and branching properly, and N-1 and N+1, and the list of things you're not doing is like this long. But please, Cliff, tell us why it didn't work out. Yeah? What was that one thing we missed? Right? So it really, the biggest lesson I could impart today is really, you really need the discipline to keep doing all these things that matter. Right? and not to be, not to belabor the point, not to dismiss these things as, okay, yeah, I know, but I've heard all that before. If I tell you to only hold focused meetings and stick to the topic and only move on once you've closed that topic, you'll say, yeah, of course I know that. If I say to do inspections and do them to a certain level of quality, you'll say, of course we know that and we already do it. And version control and. Right? But I mean, to do the things right the way you know they should be done, and to have the discipline and persistence to keep at that until you get it done the right way. And the flip side of that discipline then is it takes an incredible amount of focus. So what I typically see when I go in and look at projects, particularly projects that are in trouble, is you'll see, people aren't idle, they're not sitting around, or they're not sitting around doing the wrong things. You generally also lots of busyness. Right? But busyness, it's hard to get used to slides over there. Busyness doesn't mean meaningful progress, right? We'll see lots of simultaneous activities. An amateurish project manager will have a Gantt chart with lots and lots of bars running in parallel because it feels good. Like, look at all of this stuff that's happening. But if you take a close look, not much is actually getting completed though. Right? So don't confuse busyness with meaningful progress. All of that activity might feel good, but meaningful progress is the only thing that actually matters. Right? And this is embedded in a lot of people's thinking. Peter Code, many years ago, talked about frequent, tangible working results as what matters. Jim Highsmith, one of the founders in the Agile community, talks about working code being the ultimate arbor of real progress. Jerry Weinberg, way before all of us, talks about breaking things down by form and or function so you can attack a big problem. And that really is the key. That focus to break things down into small pieces that we can actually get our arms around, and then the discipline to stay on those tasks and complete them before you move on to the next one. And this applies to everything, not just an architecture or a software design. It applies to meetings and working sessions, which is where we burn a hell of a lot of time in a project. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this. I think we're doing it right time-wise. So when you come to do a large project, I mean, they're complex, right? There's a lot of concerns, and there's dependencies and codependencies and relationships, and it's hard to get your arms around a thing. It's hard to know where to start. It's hard to break it down, put a structure to it. Right? And so that naturally is what leads us to get into a meeting and talk about 16 different things simultaneously, because they're all somewhat related, they're all interesting, they're all important. Right? But what we really got to do is, well, are there a few things that we can get our hands around, relatively standalone, and we understand well enough that if we worked on this piece, or discussed this piece, if it was in a meeting, right, we could complete it, we could close it. And you'll probably be able to identify a few of those. Oh, great, do those first. And then the act of doing those things in sufficient detail to complete them, or to get them to closure, will let you be able to identify the next few things that are like that. And then the next few, and then very quickly you will be able to get your arms around this thing now, you will be able to break it down, put a structure to it, outline it, plan it, track it, whatever. But it takes great focus and it takes great discipline. So this works in modelling. I'm not going to be talking about modelling in Russia this week, but when we do modelling, we'll break that down into what we call micro steps. We'll model a tiny, tiny little slice of a few classes only. Because we know from experience, if I introduce even one extra consideration on this method, it's too much, it's too complicated for people, we get confused. So let's get this piece right first, and then we can look at this other concern of this same interaction between these same classes. Same thing as I say in meetings. Right? So pick a topic, something small, discuss it, to closure, end the meeting, great. Something's done. Done is good. You get to say completed. Completed is a terrific word for morale on a project. If you get to say completed a lot, that's great. Yeah. And then we can move on to the next thing. So as I say, this takes great focus and discipline. I never see this in practice, right? And if you could just take this away only from today and get better at those two things only, you'll be far, far better and more useful software people than any other process or tool or whatever we might talk about. Yeah? Just that alone will make a huge difference. All right, so let's give you a few tools for some of these things I've talked about then. So working sessions. In a working session it could be a meeting. It might be a meeting to discuss administrative things in terms of a project. It might be a meeting to discuss a design or whatever. Right? And what I find usually is that the most difficult task for any group is to actually know what its task is. So if I'm running a project, I might be sitting in my office, a bunch of people have called a meeting, they come in and they start talking, and I'll let that discussion run for a few minutes. And then usually after 3, 4 minutes, 5 at the most, some number of separate topics have been raised. And at that point I'll stop, say, okay, and I'll ask 2 questions. The first is, what's the purpose of this meeting? What's the topic we're actually here to discuss? And the second one will be, and at the end of it'll be 30 minutes or an hour, since we always tend to block in calendar units these days. At the end of that hour or whatever, what's the outcome you need? And if I can't get a crisp, clear answer to that question, the meeting's over. Because all we're going to do is waste time. There'll be activity, but we're not actually going to close anything. So this is one of the most difficult tasks, and I've just given you the example at the meeting. So imagine that a whole project. Imagine the project's been running for a few years and it's in trouble, and I'm called in and I go around and I interview people and I ask them, what's the purpose of this project? Hopefully you can imagine the enormous variety of answers you get to that. Right? And then of course, how could you hit a target if, well, there's 10 different targets people think they're trying to hit? Yeah? So what we want to do with our working sessions is have a clear topic with some directly associated desired outcome or result. And that could be in the form of a work product, such as a bulleted list with consensus. There might be a work product outcome example, or another example might be what I call knowledge or knowledge transfer, which is we're here to gain understanding of blah, so that blah, blah, blah. And blah probably doesn't translate, does it? We're here to get an understanding of something, so that something, something, something. Yeah? Right, so there's 2 ways you can get better at that. Now, if I'm running a large project, particularly in a like a Fortune 500 or a large enterprise company, often at the start I'll enforce publish agendas before any meetings happen, and if they don't meet these criteria, we don't have the meetings. And that's a little bit extreme, but I want to imprint the behaviour at the start, and then we'll back off on that. People get the idea, and people generally will do the right thing. Yeah. All right, so that's one useful tool. Here's another one. This is a useful mental model for working sessions. So when we come together, we start opening where we're generating new ideas, right? And then we get into the narrowing phase now where we're starting to evaluate these ideas. And then when we're in the close, we're looking to try and get agreement and closure on something. And so what you want to do is all together as a group, all open and all narrow and all close. This is another great time sink where a heck of a lot of time is wasted in any working session. There's sort of 2 formats, but the most common one is where we're in the close and someone's going to go back and restate the open and restate the narrow. Right? The other example, of course, is where we just keep opening all the time. Now, the beauty of these very simple little mental models, though, is that by sharing them with your team, by explaining them before you start, you are effectively getting permission to now facilitate using this. So, for example, something that would otherwise be pretty difficult to do. So imagine you're in a joint requirement session and the business are there, and one of the business people keeps opening, right? Because I've taught this material before we started, I can simply go, hey, are you closing or are you opening? And that's pretty much all I need to do to facilitate that. Where without this mental model in place first, that's actually a pretty hard thing to do. I'm trying to tell a business person to shut up, right? Which is not normally easy to do. All right. In concert with this is another real simple technique called rat holes. And this is basically, we'll get a piece of flip chart paper, you can put it on a stand or on the wall, and what it does is we'll record issues or items that aren't within the agenda of a current working session, because they all have a nice clear topic now with a clear outcome or result, but they are important and should be looked at. And there's some good group psychology that goes on here, and that is, so when someone thinks of this unrelated thing, it's outside the agenda of this working session, but it is important, the act of physically going over and catching it will make it that much easier for the person to let it go and switch back to the current topic at hand, because they can see it's physically captured there. And it makes it just that little bit easier for them to let go of it. Right? You can make it everyone's job to call out a rat hole item. It's a good way to stick to published agendas, and then you capture these things and publish the rat holes and schedule meetings to discuss those. Now, again, this stuff I'm teaching you right now might sound really basic and really boring. I'm a really good project manager, and I'm telling you, these are my secrets. These are the things that make my stuff work. Right? Now, you can also see the life cycle of team development going on here. As a team moves through, in fact, I'm going to talk about it on the next slide, forming, norming, storming, etc. So at the start, it might be the facilitator or whatever that's identifying a rat hole and recording it. But as people learn these behaviours, you'll get to the point where you might be in a working session, someone's talking, and someone else, without even speaking, will get up, go over to that piece of paper, write their rat hole item on it, and come back and sit down without even having spoken. And that's a performing team behaviour. Right? So that's what we're looking for. Okay, I want to share with you another tool, which is a team development cycle. This is one of the most useful mental models I've ever seen for dealing with team development. So every team goes through this development cycle. We start off where we're forming. You know, there's superficial relationships, there's impersonal norms, there's cautiousness, watchfulness, uncertainty, there's dependencies on the leader, etc. And then we get into storming, where there's a little bit of barking going on, but not too much biting, right, hopefully. And this is where issues of role and responsibility or process and procedure are going to surface, and you're looking for clarification. If we push through that, we get through to norming, where now it really starts to feel like we're getting some work done. We feelings start to emerge. There's a sense of comfort and belonging. And ideally, we want to get round to performing. And performing is best described by, after some working session, you'll hear something like, it's amazing how much we've got done just then, or it's amazing how much we've accomplished recently. And so obviously performing teams are what we're aiming for. Now, these steps are a sequence. You can't go to norming or performing without some storming first, and that's a really useful part of the model. Because knowing that storming is a part of a cycle and a part of this process means that when the team hears some storming or hears some barking, they'll think, okay, good, that means we're storming now. As a project manager, when I see the storming clouds on the horizon, I'm smiling. That's a good thing. That means we're moving, and one of my jobs as that lead is to try and help the team move through storming as quickly as possible. And there's some good communication techniques that can help with that. But again, understanding that there's this dip and it's a part of a cycle of growth is the important thing. And so what you want to do is push through it, because if you push through it, you get to norming and performing. Norming and performing teams are good for a project manager because the people are much more productive. But they're good for the team members because those teams are much more fun to be a part of. Right? And so if everyone understands this, rather than back away when we hear some barking, we might stick with it a little bit longer and hopefully push through it, and we can get through to better days. Yeah? So that's the idea. Oh, you can drop back to an early stage every once in a while. An example of that might be when somebody new joins the team. That might pull the team back to forming for a short period of time. Okay? So that's an example. But it is a sequence. You can't go direct from forming to norming or performing without some storming first. If you think you have gone directly to those phases, you really are still back at forming. Yeah? And most teams worldwide that I see are forming teams. Right? These things haven't been resolved. These issues are out there. And because of it, we're a lot less effective. Right? Because I've got some issue on my mind, but because I resist or I'm afraid of the perception of confrontation by raising that issue or surfacing it, I'm going to sit on it. Yeah? And so it festers. But because of it, I'm less productive, and potentially because of whatever the issue is, the whole team's less productive. Right? Okay, another tool I want to share with you then is what we call norms, which is basically a permission to facilitate. And what we would do if we were actually going to be working on a project together, or if I was teaching, say, I have a 2-day modelling class, if I was teaching that modelling workshop, I would stop before we start and collect norms. Right? I use this process on my own class. So again, we'll get a piece of flip chart paper on a stand or whatever, and I'll write norms across the top. And what these are the basic ground rules we all agree will make us more productive and effective as we work together. Yeah. And so you collect these things, and these are just some examples of them. But again, by everyone going through that, there's some sort of buy-in to it, and it also now gives me as the lead. And, you know, I'm talking about lots of different hats, but a project manager's actually wearing all of those hats. He's a facilitator, and he's a lead, and he's a motivator, and right? That's a project manager, not a project administrator. Yeah? So by putting these things up on the board, I get the permission to facilitate against them as well. So these are some good ones, some examples, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about a couple of them to give you a feel for the kind of dynamics that are going on in a lot of organisations. So have fun is always a good one to have. I like to put that there if no one else thinks of it. Now, one speaks or listen is a bit of a malaise in enterprises. But if you've got multiple people speaking, it should be fairly obvious, right? We're going to miss things or we're not going to get things closed. And listen to understand is an excellent one, but it's one that's very hard to put into practice. I want to talk about these two because they often play together. So with one speaks or listen, if an organisation, and I find organisations have strong cultures, so if I'm working with a team at some company, and one speaks or listen is a problem. So that means either multiple conversations are going on at the same time, or you never get to finish a sentence before someone jumps in with whatever it is they want to say. Right? Then to me, I find that's usually pretty representative of the company as a whole. So if that behaviour is allowed to exist in one place, it tends to spread and becomes corporate behaviour, which is a bad thing. If it's particularly bad, what you can do is, there are techniques, I don't have a toy here or whatever, you can use a toy or a rubber ball or something like that, and you could, let's pretend it's this fun. So I've got this toy here, and only the person holding this thing is allowed to speak. And if you want to speak, I mean, you can raise your hand or whatever to try and get their attention, but until they yield and pass the ball, you're not able to speak. And so it slows things down, and it puts these enforced breaks in that makes it easier for us to listen to understand. So let's talk about listen to understand for a minute. Words are very emotive, right? And they cause emotional triggers to fire in the brain. Someone says something, and something they said fires one of these emotional triggers. Right? And we start thinking about that. Right? We start thinking about that a lot. And we start thinking about what we'd like to say about that. And now I'm looking for a break in whatever their communication pattern is where I can interject and now say this thing that I want to say about that. And the whole time I've been doing this, I'm no longer listening. So listen to understand is a good one, but it's very hard to put into practice. And so again, that ball technique can work as well. Why? Because you now know that you can't just interrupt and say something. The only way you're going to get to speak is if you get this toy passed to you. And so it changes your mental model. It enforces some latency between one thing that's said and then the next speaker. And as I said, it breaks this mental model, so you're more likely to actually listen to what's being said and understand it rather than just get hung up on what it is I want to say and jump in. So there are triggers to look for, as I said. If people don't get to finish sentences before someone else jumps in, that's an example of this sort of thing in play. And so these are some of the things you can do about it. But again, if you think about these things, how can we possibly be effective if we don't do that stuff well? People are the single biggest variable in any project, and we know that. It's one of the most well-measured, experimented things in IT. The good people are anywhere from 10 to 50x. They're not so good. Yeah. And yet if we constrain ourselves so poorly by these sorts of behaviours, right, what a colossal waste of such a resource. So again, these things really, really matter. All right, the rest are fairly self-explanatory, but so this is an example of what norms are, and again, because they come from the team, and the team doesn't realise this, when you ask the group for, okay, what would we like to have our norms be for this project we're going to do over the next 2 weeks? Yeah? Let's say, this modelling activity we're going to do or something. What are the basic ground rules we all think will make us be more effective and more productive together? And they come from the team. Now, I can give you a little tip. When they do that, what they don't realise, though, is that they're also telling you what the problems are actually within the organisation. So if they volunteer, for example, something like that, that's telling you that they generally see that as a problem when right, when they try to hold meetings or get things done. So as the project manager or the team lead or facilitator, whatever hat you're wearing, it sort of gives you a heads up on the kinds of issues these people have, the most effective resource there is, right? The kinds of issues these people have when they try and work together. All right, next one is a norm, particularly for an IT project that I always like to put forward. And this is a really, really useful one. And it's called the consensus norm. And we agree to this definition of consensus, where consensus is a choice each person can live with, help, support, and implement. And reaching consensus means you're okay with the decision. But it doesn't mean you like it. You don't have to like it. It just means that you agree, right, not to quit over it, which is, the can live with part, and not to talk down about it, which is to go out, help, support, and implement it. And it's a very different mental model. So I'll give you an example, since we're an IT audience, from something in IT. So if we're doing modelling, often you'll have, say, two different model shapes that solve the same problem. And which one do we want to go with? Shape A or shape B? It's a very different way of thinking that, I don't have to love this, but all I have to do, the only line I have to get over is that I can live with it, I can support it. It's not what I would have gone with, but yeah, you know what? Everyone else seems to like it, I'm okay with it, I'll support it, I'll implement it. I don't have to love it though. I can't stress enough how useful a technique this is, particularly in IT projects, this difference in mental model. But I'll also tell you, interestingly, when I do this sort of stuff, and I do, like I said, very large projects with big companies, I get a lot of feedback from business people on how powerful this consensus norm is, this different way of thinking about being okay with a decision. Right? Jim Highsmith talks about agile decision making or participatory decision making, and he'll go to a group and he'll ask them, "What's your decision making process?" And you'll get like blank stares generally. Yeah? So that's a participatory decision making process. Okay, so that's an amazingly useful model for project teams. It's useful during requirements, it's useful during analysis, it's useful during design, in particularly upper life cycle things. So it's less useful in general, lower in the life cycle, say during coding and implementation, because generally there it's things like coding standards and whatever that are driving what we should be doing. There's less sort of decision making like that going on. But anywhere you have a decision to make, it's a great model. Okay, I think this is the last one of these people ones. Plus deltas. This is a very simple continuous process improvement technique. A bunch of other agile methods have sort of borrowed from this in different ways. This is something we were doing for a long, long time. So again, piece of flip chart paper on a stand. At the end of the day, what I'll do is I'll go to the stand and I'll write the day on it. And today is, what is today, Tuesday? Yeah, it's Tuesday. Okay, so I'll write Tuesday. And I'll put a big plus sign on the left, and I'll ask people, okay, what worked well today? What did we like? What did we achieve? And we'll record those things from the group. Yeah? And then I'll go over to the minus side, except I'm not going to draw a minus sign. There is no minus side. I'm going to draw a triangle instead, and I'm going to look for deltas. So I'm going to ask something like, what could we do differently tomorrow that would make us even more effective and productive than we were today? And then we'll capture those things on the right-hand side. And it's a very simple way to continuously improve what you're doing day by day. As I said, I even do this when I run a 2-day class, a class I've run many times. So I'll run plus deltas on my own class and modify what we're doing from one day to the next. Again, there's some psychologies involved. Because they're called deltas and not minuses, people are more likely to tell you what's on their mind, because generally people are frightened of being critical. Now, I know there are always exceptions. There are people that love to criticise, right? But that's the exception case. We don't optimise for that. We want to optimise for the majority, normal humans. These are some examples from an actual project. So you can see here on the Monday, on the Delta side, there was some problem with the handouts. I've long since forgotten whatever that was. But one speaks or listen was a problem. Listening to understand was a problem. People weren't coming back on time. That was a problem. And they wanted more tips, more examples. And you can see on the Tuesday now, most of those things have actually ended up being pluses. Because we got that feedback, we were able to do something about it, change the way we acted the next day, and improve. So a very simple way to do continuous process improvement. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about this before I move on to a new topic is I want to talk to you about change. And this model here is the way most of us tend to think about change. And that is that a simple vision of a better way to do things, right, affects a direct movement from the current way of doing things to a new way of doing things. Right? And that's how change works. And that's quite wrong, and it's much more complicated than that. Now, an expert in family therapy, actually, that's where this material came from. A family therapist by the name of Virginia Satir described change this way. And she said that change always involves these 4 stages, never fewer. And there's no meaningful chance of affecting meaningful change without going through these 4 phases. So here we are at today, and then there's some catalyst for change, some foreign element, right? It might be, someone decides we're going to go agile, or we're going to, use some new method, or whatever it is, or we're going to switch to some new tool, or sales of a flagship product this quarter may have fallen for the first time in history. So something has changed, and now we're trying to do things differently, and we fall into chaos. And chaos is where, our effectiveness actually does drop because we're not proficient at this new thing yet. And it can feel like we're actually worse off now than we were before. We've decided to go agile and we've chosen some method. It doesn't matter which one it is. But I don't know. I don't feel like this is an improvement at all. Some people say I feel like we're actually worse off. And the truth is you actually are worse off for now. But then as we stick with it, we get into practice and integration. So practice and integration, if you wanted to plot your level of performance, it would start here, it drops, and then practice and integration is the upswing of the curve as we get more proficient with these things. Now this is also very threatening to people because the masters of the old are now novices of the new, and that can be quite threatening, especially if you're used to being, the most experienced or knowledgeable person, and now you're not. And usually there's some sort of transforming idea that represents the knee of that curve. And a good example of a transforming idea in an IT project might be what we call a structured huddle. So let's say we've decided to go OO modelling for the first time, and you might hear a team member say, hey, to some other colleagues, let's get together this afternoon, maybe 3 o'clock, and let's go over some of these model fragments together. That's an example of a structured huddle or the transforming idea. So we're now on practice and integration, which is the upswing of the curve. And of course, once we've switched to becomes what we do, then we've arrived at the new status quo. Now, the important part of this mental model is that chaos is an integral part of change, but in that naive view of the world, we don't expect it. And so when it happens, we mistake it for the new status quo. And since the new status quo is so chaotic, that's when you'll get that change back message. Well, I think we should switch back. I'm not sure this new thing really is that good after all. Right? So when you're looking for this, your chances of dealing with it sensibly are vastly improved. Right? And I think this sort of change stuff underpins most of the difficulties we have in IT, in software projects, within the IT shop itself and within the business, which is something I want to talk about next. Because change is actually very threatening to people. So one of the ways to deal with this is, there's a lot, there's a whole topic on this I could talk about, but setting expectation levels as an example is a great way to help explain this and then deal with it better. The transition, say, from structured programming to OO, is 6 to 9 months to develop proficiency, 2 to 3 years to develop mastery. We know those sort of timelines, and setting those expectations with the organisation is going to help you or buy you more time to try and institute that change program. It's an old example, but same. When we went from C to C++, there were sort of similar timelines, about 6 to 9 months for proficiency, 2 to 3 years for mastery, although I think you could make a pretty good case that no one could ever master C++, but anyway, that's a different discussion. All right, so what I want to move on to now is talk about some material that I've never presented anywhere before, This is something that's been on my mind for a while. I'm going to share it with you today for the first time. We'll see how it goes. The slides are a little, they got written on the plane yesterday, but this is another dimension I think we need to be paying attention to. So first is, there's these levels of things in software projects, and it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. So you started off, we thought about tools. It was all about tools. If only we had this new tool that someone wants to sell us, that'll fix all our problems. And then we sort of got more sophisticated and we moved on to techniques, and we thought, yeah, well, no, it's not just the tools, it's also what techniques. You know, and XP is a good example of that. Here's a list of 12 practices that are pretty useful. Yeah? And then we got more sophisticated and we thought, well, actually, there's these processes around. And remember, some are way better than others, but have assembled a bunch of techniques and some other patterns of play that lead to greater chances of success. And you could argue that's sort of where we are right now with what has been a good thing with the move from waterfall to agile. Now, agile is absolutely no silver bullet, and there's a lot of problems there too, but that whole movement is absolutely worthwhile and has been a step forward from where we were. But really at the core of it all is still people. And to me, it's just people is everything. And when I think about this stuff, just like when you peel an onion, you know, it makes you cry. Yeah? I do. I get sad when I think about this stuff. But, all right, so let's talk about it. What's an organisation? Right? Here's a quickly drawn org chart. I haven't bothered, you know, exploding out all of the boxes, but imagine it's a real organisation and there'd be multiple lines and boxes out all over this thing, right? Okay, so whenever we're doing something like this, it's for some organisation. So what is an organisation? An organisation is people, hierarchy, and processes. Now, and the hierarchy and the processes then determine the roles that people play and the interactions between the people. But have you noticed how often the word people got used? Right. So, people have different needs to get their jobs done. They have task needs, and that's the least interesting part to me, but task needs revolve around, you know, communication and organisation. But people also have interpersonal needs. Right? So when you're asked to join, we talk about it in the context of a project, when you're asked to join a project, right, we have interpersonal needs, or you join a new organisation, right, we have a need for inclusion. We have a need to feel important, to have a place on the team, to be valued. And achieving all of those things involves, well, a lot of steps actually. It involves the resolution of any authority and influence issues, like, well, I thought I was here to work on X, but Johannes seems to think he's here to work on X, so who's doing X? Is it me or is it Johannes? Or are we supposed to work on it together? Like, how's that going to work? So resolving those things is a necessary step. Right? Clarifying roles and procedures, clarifying goals and organisational structures. And when we achieve all of those things, then we have this sense of comfort and a sense of belonging. We understand our role, we have a place, we think it's valued, we feel important, we feel part of a team. And organisationally, then, in terms of task, we have cohesiveness and we have interdependence, right? Which is great. And I wish all companies were like this, but there's more to it. What other concerns do employees have? And when I started thinking about how to articulate this, I first off assumed it would be different for execs than individuals. And I no longer think it is. I think the only difference is just the span and power and range of power and influence that's different. But I think the issues are actually the same. So what are we concerned about? We're concerned about our status. And we're concerned about our status with our peers, with subordinates, if we have direct people working for us, or lessers, and they might not directly report to me, but I'm a level X programmer and they're a level X minus one. And then the managers or seniors. Right? Again, I may not directly report to someone, but I may have peers that have more seniority than I do. And so we're all concerned about that status. That's a natural human thing. We're also concerned about what it is you control. So if you're a manager, it's your department. If you're a team lead, it's your team. And if you're an individual, then it's my part of it, whatever that happens to be. If I'm a programmer, that might be the classes I own in this project, or if I'm a toolsmith, it's the tool I support, or a server guy, it's the servers I look after, or whatever. Right? But they're the things you're concerned about. And I think the only thing that's different as you go from an individual all the way up through an exec is really that power or influence and span. And even then, perhaps, this is fresh thinking, so I'm not sure, I haven't finished that thought. But understanding this stuff in the context of that organisation chart, so remember that diagram from a few slides ago, right? Because this is what's really driving people in any company. It's a big deal. How are people in an organisation incented? These are rhetorical questions. You know the answers, so I don't need you to call them out. But yeah, how are you incented? How are they rewarded? How are they appraised? Right? They're the things that are a concern to people. Right? But when we come in to do some new software project, right, well, we're threatening to change all of that. And so that's a very big deal. Now, I talked about how you incented, how you're rewarded, how you're appraised. I mean, there's a little bit of a side topic there too, which is that, I think measurement systems have really got a long way to go to catch up to the modern age. But, for example, if a project manager cancelled 6 projects early because he saw they'd been invalidated, right? Meaning, let's say, they no longer satisfy the business case, right? Would that guy be promoted or fired? Well, fired mostly, because what we tend to do is we'll force a project through to completion, even though it no longer is doing what it set out to do, and even though the date has long since been missed or the budget's been exhausted, or we'll continue these death marches until the end, because that's actually where your measurement's going to come from. We'll more reward someone or recognise someone that completed 6 projects, even if they did the wrong thing. A programmer, who do we reward more? Someone that writes 35,000 lines of code, or someone that writes 5,000 lines of code and reused 30,000 lines of code? The guy that wrote 35,000 lines of code tends to get rewarded more, and yet the other guy is much smarter. So this is just an example of what I mean. When you think about what an organisation is and that hierarchy and what the incentives are and how you're measured and how you're appraised, those things are in direct conflict with actual better behaviours. So when we come to do a software project in an organisation, a software project by definition is going to change some process, some business process, and processes span these hierarchies. And so everyone that process touches is in some way affected by this change. A new system involves change. A new system changes processes. Every time we deliver a new IT or software system, we're forcing people to change the way they work. We might even be redefining their jobs entirely. That sort of code for, we might even be firing people, right? A very common goal of a project for managers is, I want to reduce headcount as a result of this improvement. Right? So these things are very threatening. And so that's just individually how threatening that can be. It changes my role, it changes how I interact with other people. Right? How's that going to affect my status? How's that going to affect what it is I control today? Yeah. So that's at the individual level. So then extend that up to the team and then to the department and so on up the org chart, and you get a feel for some of the issues that are going on here. And so, yeah, it's great to talk about, well, you can come in and run FTD, or you can use Scrum, or you can use this or that or whatever else. But honestly, you've got all of these other things going on around you that really, really matter. And if they're ignored, well, if the thing's a success, it's sort of an accident. Yeah? We were a bit lucky. It's also good to remember the fundamental response to change is not logical but emotional, right? So anytime you apply a rational discussion of why some change is going to be better, that generally doesn't work out too well. And that's unfortunately a technique we use a lot as IT people. We talk about how much better something will be as a result of this change. This new system will be so much better than the current one because blah, 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 and we list all these advantages. But you need to think about that for a minute though first. By implication, what are we saying about the current system? That list of advantages of the new system is implying that these are all things that are bad about the current system. All right? Who implemented the current system? How do you think they might feel about that characterisation? Right? So change is very emotional, and we need to be a lot smarter how we participate with people and describe change. And so, as I'm saying, it tends to be emotional. Applying that rational or logical argument about why something will be better, which is very natural for us to do as IT people, generally, though, is a bad people practice. Right? So instead, find a way to celebrate change rather than compare and contrast like that. Okay, so I'm running out of time. We're concerned with the distribution of power and influence in any organisation. There can be resistance of influence by others. And this is what happens when change occurs, and so we need to get back to cohesiveness and interdependence. So what I've described so far then is this fear of success is just from the business perspective, the way I've described it. It's a little easy to understand. You have exactly the same issues within the IT organisation as well, though. And even more so if, as a part of this software project, where you're going to use some new process or some new tool or some new technique. And I would say it's an order of magnitude more important if all of the above is in play, which is very common. We're going to do this new system, it's going to change all these business processes, and we're using a new software development methodology for it, and some new software, some tool change stuff as well. All of that change and its effect on the different people, remember, go back to the org chart, and their concerns and their status and their span of control, that absolutely overwhelms which process or which tool or whatever we happen to be using. So, again, a tip in terms of then selecting an agile methodology as an example. Some processes embed these concerns and enable dealing with them in far better ways than other methods. Right? And so my advice would be to look for something like that. All right, so we get to what I call this fear of success then. So a manager could feel threatened because, well, you know, if this thing succeeds, this project succeeds, my department, and hence myself, may be diminished in some way. He may not be right, or he may absolutely be right about that, but either way, there's this uncertainty. I may end up having less influence and less status in the organisation, right? Why would someone like that be motivated to really push this thing to be the best success it can if they have these sorts of concerns? We need to be aware of these factors and deal with them, right? To give yourself the best chance of project success. Even an individual, a lowly programmer, as they say, for example, right? If this thing succeeds, my abilities may be exposed. One of the great things about some of the agile methods, FTD in particular, is they're very transparent. But this transparency can also be very threatening. And so if my abilities are exposed in such an open and transparent way, I may have less influence and less status as well with my peers. And I think there's an index you could plot, SM index you call it, the selfish or malicious index, that would plot what effect are these concerns actually going to have on your project. And I think there could be some sort of scale here, and depending on how selfish or malicious the person is, you know, on the low end of the scale, they might just opt out of the thing, not participate, which is a problem. And at the high end of the scale, of course, then they may actually undermine the project, even make it fail. And I'm not making this stuff up. You'll see, especially on Thursday in my workshop, it's full of examples from real projects. Everything I talk about is stuff I've experienced. None of this stuff is made up or theory. Right? So I've actually seen this sort of stuff happen a lot. And you want to be careful too. Even a lowly programmer can do enormous damage. If you go back to that, I need to jump back a few slides, quite a few here. I'll give you a shape that I've seen happen more than once. So a lowly programmer, say someone down here, but with the support of a manager, say at this level or this level, who also feels threatened about a project, boy, those two people can collaborate and cause a project an enormous amount of damage. Right? So we need to understand these things so that we can go out and then do things about it. Right? Set expectation levels. Be more collaborative. If you see people opting out, get them involved. You know, make sure you've got the business sponsors on hand. You regularly have discussions. Take the business people off process, and have conversations about, okay, in this modelling session today or in this requirement session today, we thought there was a better way to do this, and we're going to change the process in such and such a way, and reassure people, give them a chance to voice their concerns, give them a chance to reassure themselves, Talk to top management if you can see there may be an issue here, and say, look, this person over here looks like he might lose a lot of his span of control today. So he'll need to be reassured that there'll be some other role in place, or you know what I mean. But you've got to watch for these things and factor them in. They matter. They absolutely matter. Because if you don't, and these sorts of behaviours are in place, it doesn't really matter what process or tool chain you're using. These things are going to overwhelm it. All right, enough on that stuff. Let's talk in the last 5 minutes real quick about a couple of things from FDD itself. So as a project manager, what are some of your pain points? I've just talked about a lot of them actually, but one of the ones that's more commonly understood is this, and it's how do you feel about answering these two questions? How far along are you? How far is there left to go? Right? It's hard to be accurate about this stuff. It's even harder to be accurate and answer them in a meaningful way. And so that's where I think feature-driven development can come in and help. Why did that not work? Yep. Oh, it did. Okay. What I'm seeing here is not what's happening there. Anyway. Okay. So there's a couple of things in FDD, a few tools I want to highlight that can help here, but obviously Thursday we're going to spend the entire day talking about this stuff. One of the things FDD does is it has this concept called the feature breakdown structure. It's first class in FDD, or it's otherwise known as the features list. And an FDD feature is a tiny granular piece of client-valued function. And in FDD, this list is built after the develop an overall model process, which is where we've done all our requirements analysis together with the business and got all that knowledge transfer. And it's built by simple functional decomposition of the domain, of the business itself. There are no IT features in it. Everything must be expressed in client-valued terms. We don't talk about setting up a database, or we don't talk about setting up some mail server or whatever. We express those things in client-valued language instead. And the entire project is described, scoped and bounded this way. Now structurally, a feature breakdown structure is the same as a work breakdown structure. It's a categorised list of things. But that's where the similarity ends. The approach and the mindset is completely different between the two things. So in feature-driven development, that feature breakdown structure, that features list, it's the plan, it's the means of tracking and reporting, it's the way we get frequent tangible working results. Because they're very granular, we get to say completed all the time, we get working code. It's a good thing. Yeah? So that's a good way to help. If we do that, take that sort of approach, we can use other good visualisation techniques. Here's one called the parking lot chart. This is a visual expression of part of that features list. And this is a real one from a lending project that was done for a client in Singapore a number of years ago. This, at the time, was one of the largest Java development projects in the world. It had run and failed. I came in and took it over. And you'll see here, everything on here is a expression of the business. This is lending. How do you get a loan from a bank? We establish an application. We establish what sort of loan product or facility it is, what sort of collateral or security we'll provide. We go through approval processes, we evaluate credit, et cetera, and everything in here. Here we're establishing debt equity ratios, establishing fund flow statements, establishing disbursement details. It's colour-coded. Green means we're done, white's not started, blue's in progress, and there's these bars and percentages to tell you how far we're moving along. But it's a very, very effective tool. This has been widely appropriated, copied, stolen, replicated, so you know it's good when that happens. And I'll explain to you on Thursday how to build and use these things, but this is something, again, we get tremendous feedback from. It's a great way to describe a project and track a project with the client. And out of this approach, you can then also get some nice detailed reports that sort of look a little bit like this. And there's some KPIs that we can track along here. So inside the implementation subject area, let's pick something that's not finished. Established disbursement details, there's 35 new features, or 35 features in it. 4 of them are behind schedule, 31 are done, it's 91% complete. The roll-up for that whole subject area, 155 features, 74% complete. The roll-up for the whole project, 1,013 features, 96% done. Very accurate, very meaningful, because it's all in client language. And we'll teach you how to do this stuff on Thursday. So last thing on that, then, as a project manager, what we want is really good visibility. We would like predictive metrics, and especially predictive metrics based on early available indicators. And FDD has several of these. For example, one of them is to know around day 6 or 7 of a project if a 6-month construction estimate is actually good or not. Okay, and so we'll teach you how to do that stuff on Thursday. Okay, so that's a look at FDD, 5 processes only, 1 to 2 pages each. Let's summarise and close. So, what we really need, why we fail and what we need to do to get better, is we need that focus and discipline to insist on doing the things that we pretty much already know matter, and not to default on them, not to allow that corner to be cut, because it matters. So it's the focus to break things down into small pieces, and then the discipline to stay on that task, complete it, move on to the next one, and to also insist, though, with others above or below us that these things need to be done because we know they matter. So it needs that focus and the discipline. This is the silver bullet. I know it's boring and I'm sorry, but this is it. There is no new tool or technique or process silver bullet. I don't believe there ever will be. Software construction is a human activity. Unless it stops being a human activity, these things are always going to matter more. I think to really be agile, you need agile people. And what I've shared with you today are some of the tools I think can help you make your people be more agile. So we want to pay much more attention to people issues. Process is secondary, but it is an enabler. Some processes are much more targeted and enabling than others. Some processes are just a list of techniques, that completely ignores the people dimension. Other processes have come from people that are experienced project managers and really embrace project management versus project administration. Those processes, I think, are going to be much more helpful to you. All right, so thanks very much for your time. It's been great to be here, and hopefully we'll talk to some more of you on Thursday in a lot more detail about feature-driven development. Thank you very much. Now I think it's a break.